Thus, patience is a quality, habit, or capacity associated not only with a tranquil and calm disposition, but also with endurance and tolerance of challenges, hardship, and suffering. There is also the notion of self-control and steadiness. Yet despite this noble profile, patience is not a popular virtue and in fact does not even qualify to be called a virtue in some traditions. Let us turn now to a consideration of the notion of virtue and to the understanding of patience we can glean from philosophers and religious traditions. According to Alistair MacIntyre, there is a considerable range and diversity of treatments of the virtues, and we will find different lists of virtues in Homer, Sophocles, Aristotle, the New Testament, medieval thinkers, Eastern and Western traditions, and so on. While we do not in this paper have the liberty to trace MacIntyre's argument in his chapter on the nature of the virtues, it is helpful to note what he calls his tentative definition. A virtue is an acquired human quality, the possession and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to practices, and the lack of which effectively prevents us from achieving any such goods. Stan van Hooft tells us that virtue is a word deriving from the Latin virtus, meaning excellence, capacity, or ability. In this sense, to have a virtue is to have power or ability to achieve something. More commonly, he says, in modern English, the word has come to refer to a disposition or a pattern in someone's character or personality that leads them to act morally. It refers to traits of character that we find admirable. Examples of virtue include generosity, honesty, courage, patience, he says, good humour, and friendliness. Now, this notion of virtues being admirable could be part of the reason why patience is so little lauded in contemporary society. We do not really value or admire those who are patient, often interpreting patience as a sign of docility, malleability, and a willingness to put up with all manner of exploitation and unsatisfactory conditions and circumstances without protest. However, this is not the only way of viewing this quality, and we need a more nuanced understanding of patience if we are to find any relevance and application of this for contemporary leaders. Certain philosophers may perhaps assist us to understand patience in this more nuanced way. Although there seems to be some debate as to whether Aristotle actually included patience as one of his virtues, Van Hooft claims that in Aristotle's scheme of the virtues, patience is the mean between the excess of irascibility and the deficiency called lack of spirit. Alistair MacIntyre, the well-known contemporary philosopher, disagrees and notes that patience is not mentioned by Aristotle at all. Solomon, a business ethicist, concurs with MacIntyre, but points out that Aristotle's classic list of virtues includes good temper. If one turns to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, one will find that the term meekness is used to indicate the mean between over-aptness and anger. Now, meekness in Aristotle's view is to be praised, and a meek person would mean being imperturbable and not being led away by passion, but being angry in that manner and at those things and for the length of time which reason may direct. I would venture to suggest that meekness does not seem to have the same connotations for Aristotle as for us in contemporary life. In our society, a meek person would be one who is probably never angry, biddable, non-assertive, and mild. But Aristotle disapproves of just this type of person, notably those who exhibit angerlessness and show no anger at things which they should be angry with. Such persons are foolish. Also foolish are those who do not show anger appropriately, both in time and manner, with the person they ought to be angry with. Those who show this defect lack perception and are not inclined to take revenge as they feel no anger. For Aristotle, such persons are like slaves because they tolerate scurrility towards self and others. This would seem an important insight for contemporary leaders. If we assume meekness could be a synonym for patience, this understanding of patience does not mean tolerance of injustice and lack of action when one has the power to change things so that people might live better lives in more just conditions. Thus, Aristotle notes that despite the difficulties of discerning how to show appropriate anger, if by meek we mean show no feelings, such meekness is not really praiseworthy. For meekness to be a virtue, we need to show appropriate anger where necessary, timelessly, and in the correct way. This observation allows us to dispose of the notion that patience as meekness is not an appropriate quality or virtue for leadership because it suggests passivity, malleability, and tolerance of anything and anyone, no matter how unjust. Although we noted that self-control could be a synonym for patience, for Aristotle this is not the case. Self-control is for Aristotle a state, and while it is similar to a virtue, it's not actually a virtue. Aristotle links self-control to endurance. These two states are good and praiseworthy in those who stick to their resolutions, and thus, knowing their lusts are wrong, do not indulge them. According to Aristotle, if someone has perfected both self-control and endurance, he is a person of perfect self-mastery. However, in his view, self-control is of greater significance than endurance, given that the latter means continued resistance, while the former consists of actual mastery. This nuanced distinction between the virtue of meekness and the states of self-control and endurance adds more depth to our understanding of what we call patience, revealing a richness which has diverse implications for leadership. Leaders need to know their lusts are wrong and not indulge them. We have seen examples of the opposite in contemporary society: greed, sexual promiscuity, and corruption in some contemporary leaders. Self-mastery, which includes both the state of self-control and endurance, would be critical in many leadership contexts, while meekness, if it were passivity and a failure to be appropriately angry where necessary, for example at injustice, would be a fault in a leader. Such a fault would be greater than in a non-leader, because the leader has power, and this means power to change things, power to make things more just, which the non-leader lacks. Another insight into patience is provided by considering the Christian tradition, most particularly the work of Thomas Aquinas. According to Grach, Aquinas claimed that all virtues can be reduced to the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and 4 cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Patience is seen as one of the 4 quasi-integral parts of fortitude, necessary if a person is actually going to be able to act with courage, the others being magnanimity, magnificence, and perseverance. Thus, patience and perseverance might be necessary where a courageous person is called upon to endure bodily torment and death, as in the case of a martyr. MacIntyre believes Aquinas' treatment of the virtues to be in accord with the usual scheme of his time. That is, as Grach has observed, distinguishing between the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues. However, MacIntyre questions this and asks, but what then, for example, patience? Aquinas quotes the Epistle of St. James. Patience has its perfect work, and considers whether patience should not therefore be listed as a principal virtue. It seems from MacIntyre's account that Aquinas thought patience could be part of one of the cardinal virtues, contained in but not an independent principal virtue in itself. In medieval times, MacIntyre notes that the rank ordering of virtues would vary in practice depending on what circumstances one was trying to apply the virtues to. This provides an important insight for us. Patience is more important in certain circumstances than in others, and some circumstances might call for one aspect or nuanced version of patience, while others might call for another. MacIntyre argues that in medieval life, patience could become a very important virtue because it is a virtue of endurance in the face of evil. He believes that to have a more complete idea of specific virtues requires us to have an idea of the telos of a whole human life, conceived as a unity. To illustrate what he means here, he uses justice and patience to explain. In the case of patience, he contends it is the virtue of waiting attentively without complaint, but not of waiting for anything at all. To treat patience as a virtue presupposes some adequate answer to the question, waiting for what? He argues that while there are many situations we can envisage as requiring patience which supply a reasonable answer to this for what question, the question remains as to whether in some situations we need to give up, or whether, like the medieval exponents of the virtue of patience, there are situations in which the virtue of patience requires that I do not ever give up on some person or task, situations in which, as they would have put it, I am required to embody in my attitude to that person or task something of the patient attitude of God towards his creation.